So one, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to read my lecture because I have more to say than I probably have time, and I hope this will work. So we're facing troubling times. The conference theme of searching for truth invites us to wrestle with trying to understand the underpinnings of our many public contestations. We have argued in a recent report about the National Academy of Education, Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse, that public education has a special and sacred role to play in preparing young people to engage with these contested issues as legal citizens and as persons living in the United States who may not have documented citizenship status. We know both from history and today that the youngest of children and adolescents can weigh into these debates. From the African American children who led efforts to desegregate schools in Birmingham, Alabama, to the high school students at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. As a research community, we have both obligations, moral and intellectual, to investigate what we understand scientifically and empirically that can help the public and key stakeholders understand what contributes to these persistent civic conundrums and what evidence supports investments into building supports for better understanding civic wrestling that can lead to a common, democratically informed set of practices and systems. We have argued in this National Academy report that civic reasoning includes knowledge, epistemological dispositions to value complexity and weigh competing evidence, ethical reasoning, and dispositions to empathize with others, and openly listen to multiple points of view. We have argued that such knowledge and dispositions are complex and unfold in developmental progressions across age cohorts, young children, middle childhood, adolescence. And because of their complexity and the developmental progressions need to be supported minimally in public education across the full K to 12 spectrum and across all subject matters, and cannot be fully supported isolated in a single civics and or US history course. My focus in this talk is to examine what we can learn from what is being called the science of human learning and development, or what I call the sciences of human learning and development, to help inform how we can better understand the ontogenies of both beliefs and systemic practices that inform these civic dilemmas. I argue that these dilemmas are not new and have been present from the very beginnings of this country. The foundation of the Constitutional Convention debated, the founders of the Constitutional Convention debated whether and how to address enslavement. At the founding, only white men with capital, including human beings considered as property, were able to vote. Women did not receive the right to vote until 1920. Legal apartheid was the explicit law of the land for some 400 years before the enactment of civil rights legislation in the mid 1960s. Undemocratic immigration policies have persisted across our history against the Irish, Eastern Europeans, Jews, Asians, Muslim communities in the Arab world, and Latina communities. Anti-Semitism has a long history in the United States, a long history of failing to live up to tribal legal arrangements. Taking indigenous children from their families and forcing them into boarding schools aimed to, quote, kill the Indian. The hateful debates currently overteaching this history is the claim that such efforts will lead to children, particularly white children, being taught to hate America. However, these hateful practices are not the sole story of our country. We have a unique constitutional framework that is designed to accommodate difference, that is designed to provide pathways through which to navigate our differences, ideally informed by the ideals articulated in our Constitution. And teaching the conundrums of our history can and should also include the history of how communities and stakeholders across time have taken up our rights to contest and led to an evolution of societal practices that, while still flawed, are qualitatively different from the practices at place in our founding. As Martin Luther King has noted, the arch of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. My argument here is that the evolving syntheses across disciplines that are converging around a big set of ideas that can help us wrestle with learning to engage with complexity. That is because human learning and development are indeed complex. We have tended in the last several decades to focus primarily on cognition, assumed to entail the activation and building of neural networks in isolated regions of the brain. The construct of IQ has a long history across multiple fields. Researchers continue to use IQ as a representation of a stable construct. Fields have assumed that cognition involves processes that take place in the brains of individuals. There is a long history of looking at dispositions like motivation and executive functioning, again, as stable capacities that again exist within isolated processes within individual brains. Some fields, particularly in human development, consider issues of identity, but again, identity has been assumed to be singular and personal. There have been extensions from work in anthropology to consider the importance of culture in human communities. One thread of such work, even in earlier periods in anthropology, have assumed hierarchies in cultural communities with biases toward cultural practices associated with countries in Europe. But even with progress moving away from hierarchical attributions to cultural communities and practices, attention to culture and learning and development has suffered from what Gutierrez and Rogoff call the box problem, not addressing both homogeneity and heterogeneity within cultural communities, nor the interdependencies across communities of cultural practice. Assumptions about race have been particularly problematic. So the emerging and current syntheses of what is entailed in human learning and development focus on the following: relations among physiological processes inherited from our evolution as a species and their adaptations through epigenetic processes and participation cultural practices in influencing our goals and actions. The dynamic relationships among different levels of ecological systems that structure resource allocations, processes of interaction within and across ecological contexts, micro, meso, macro, and cultural historical. As people engage in activity, how thinking unfolds through relations among thinking, feeling, and relationships, and how these relationships shape the nature of knowledge required, particularly for participation in complex problem solving, such as knowledge that is both conceptual and procedural, epistemology, mindset, role of perceptions of self, of tasks, of settings, and of people. How development unfolds and is influenced by different levels of time: cultural historical time, ontogenetic time, microgenetic time, and overall seeking to understand how this cauldron of development unfolds through diverse pathways and at the level of individual variation and variation based on participation in and across multiple social communities, the nuclear family, extended family, social networks, institutional configurations. These developmental processes unfold not through linear causal pathways, but rather unfold in complex dynamic systems and entail dialogic relationships. This is a very complex conceptualization, one not fully realized and indeed challenging to study. I now turn to my own intellectual and personal journey, a journey that has inspired me to wrestle with this complexity. My professional training was in the teaching of English language arts at the secondary level. This held true for my undergraduate, master's, and PhD training. Initially, I taught high school English language arts, then went on to get a master's degree in English from the University of Chicago and to work in the community college system in Chicago. Coming into adulthood during the midst of the Black Power movement and the Black arts movement, I was drawn into activism and seeking to understand my African ancestry and roots. In 1974, I quit my community college position to help found an African-centered independent school to serve as the director of that school and learning to teach third graders. I always add to that note that when I did it, my mother went to her pastor and said, could he find a psychiatrist for her because the man that I would go on to marry, she said, it put the voodoo or hoodoo on. But by 1988, I decided there were so many problems of practice that I pondered that I decided um, to enter the PhD program in education from the University of Chicago. When I graduated after 3 years in 1991, I got a position as an assistant professor in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. By 1992, entering the first learning sciences program in the country, I found myself surrounded largely by cognitive psychologists. During my tenure, I had the great opportunity to co-teach a seminar that sought to bring together learning sciences and human development, the School of Education had 2 PhD programs in those fields. In co-teaching that seminar over a 10-year period with 3 different amazing colleagues in human development, opened up an intellectual world that has made lots of sense for the questions that I have sought to study. Thus, this attention to intersections among learning and development has been an intellectual journey for mine now for close to 20 years. I co-authored a handbook chapter with the neuroscientist Andy Meltzoff at the University of Washington, and have recently been engaged in lots of communications with another neuroscientist, Mary Helen Yang, Bernardino Yang. I've also in this journey been deeply influenced by Margaret Beale Spencer, whose PVEST framework, phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, that elegantly addresses issues of perceptions of identity and the processes that influence them. But in these last 12 years, the most interesting cauldron of learning has been my efforts to reconcile what I read about and study as theory with my observations of and engagements with the young cohort of my grandchildren. We have adult grandchildren, a younger cohort, 5, 6, 2, and 8, 2 8-year-olds and 1 12-year-old really coming off of a 20-year-old. It has been through observing them as they play, as they navigate relationships, as they seek to achieve their goals, that my grandma lens has turned out to be the most influential and consequential act of inquiry for me. My cell phone has become my tool of documentation, turning on the camera as unexpected moments occur. So from these 12 years of studying my grandbabies, I have come to see in action development in process, differences among the 5-year-old, the 8-year-old, and the 12-year-old. Identity development is influenced by individual differences, intergenerational cultural practices of family socialization, what we taught our kids that our kids are now teaching their children, cultural resources that they take up because of the cultural historical moment in which they're growing up, as well as how differences in parenting are shaped by the cultural historical moment of my children engaged in parenting, things that my kids do with my grandkids that I did not do and would not have considered doing when my children were growing up. Their social cognition and how they understand and navigate how they read the internal states of others, and how through observation and play they infer a range of kinds of knowledge that they are not directly taught. What has been most insightful in this grandma learning journey is that it has convinced me that even though our formal articulations of the complexities of human learning and development as theory can be overwhelming, the reality of that complexity we actually live every day. And that perhaps by seeking to capture in detail the everyday lives of children and adults within and across a variety of settings, collaborating with people, children and adults engaged in joint activity, we can actually begin to get a handle, to get a glimpse into this complexity. My hope in such effort is that reality, not imposing our prior beliefs and assumptions on what we observe, can give us insights to wrestle with our deep-seated assumptions about deficits in human community, about singular pathways of development, about stable and fixed abilities and dispositions. And perhaps if we can humble ourselves to observe reality, perhaps we can gain traction for wrestling with the multiple deficit assumptions that undergird the deep contestations we currently and historically have had in the public domain. So I will begin by showing the preview of the film Babies, produced by French director Thomas Balmes. I show this film all the time because it illustrates most convincingly the reality of diverse pathways of development as normative for our species. Like the vignettes of my grandchildren that I will share, these video clips of tasks show that children in the first year of life learn to engage in very different ways with very different supports. The specialization of this first case is that it focuses on among the most developmental periods of life, the first year of life, with an international breadth, children from Mongolia, Rwanda, Tokyo, and San Francisco. Learning to read the internal states of others.
Everything is lost. But I know that you can take it to the Lord. Everything is lost. Is it all that you can gather for yourself? Do you love a lot? Is that love that changes gifts to everyone?
One of my favorite scenes. So we see in the first, excuse me, in the first scene, children engaged in social cognition. Okay, and your baby. Learning to read the internal states of others in relationship to their own ego-focused goals. This developmental task evolves over the life course. We can see the same task playing out as both in interpersonal relations and in collective relations in the public sphere, that these same processes inform our vehement fights over issues related to how groups of people perceive their abilities to read the internal states of others and the emotional salience. My point is there's a parallel here going on. This is the underlying sort of scientific question, if you will, in terms of understanding the current fights that we're having. These battles over what is being called wokeness, over critical race theory, over assumptions about gender and sexual orientation are rooted in social cognitive processes where one group of people presume that they're able to reliably read the internal states and goals of others. My point here is that the sciences that seek to understand human learning and development are relevant to our current dilemmas. The challenge, however, is that the history of these sciences has also contributed to and reify deficit assumptions of the other. Thus, recruiting current big ideas regarding human learning and development is certainly fraught with our public wrestling with the negative histories in these disciplines. All of the babies engage in learning how to manipulate their bodies, to stand up, to walk, to manipulate objects. They all learn how to crawl by being on the ground and free to seek, to achieve goals by moving. On the other hand, they learn to manipulate objects using different objects situated within artifacts that are valued in their cultural communities and for culturally different social goals. In addition to recognizing their efforts to accomplish similar developmental goals, I also want to highlight that the body, the physical body, is an object of and tool for learning. As I move later to discuss the centrality and complex role of the physical body in learning, please note that this is my beginning foray into attention to the body. One illustration of different developmental pathways, including the range of variation in expected tasks across cultural communities, is this example from Barbara Rogoff's book, The Cultural Nature of Human Learning, of Human Development. A photograph of a 3-year-old Iwe child from Ghana handling a machete in order to forage food. If we observe this child in the United States, some would call the Department of Children and Family Services, and the child would be removed from their home. Or the 6-year-old Mayan child who was a caretaker for her infant sibling. Now on to my beloved grandbabies. So this first case, I'm not going to name the grandchildren or my children would beat me up. But this is the 4-year-old who just turned 5. So he's in karate, and it's a karate competition with only 3 people competing. Right? And so part of what he's inferred from this experience is that competition is not about winners and losers. So he's playing a game with his older sister who's 8. And she's very competitive, little 8-year-old. And whatever the game was, I don't remember. At the end, she tells him, "You lost." And he looks at her intently and he says, "You're not my sister anymore." And for me, that was a profound moment to show the depth of his social cognition. That the 2 of them, they French kiss, they sleep together. I mean, they are like tight, you know. And he realizes the importance of that relationship. And because he's angry with her, he's able to use his recognition of what that relationship meant to her to say, "I got the power to take it back." And so, this issue of how nobody taught, there's no conversations with him and his parents about fairness or play or anything of that sort. What they are as children are inferring as processes that they have inherited from their evolution as human beings. Right? The second case, again, we talk about the significance of learning along multiple dimensions of time, and one of which is cultural historical time. And so you all have kids, nieces, nephews, grandkids who are like addicted to their tablets. They are like, and there's this whole like world that they are just so deeply involved in because of this particular moment in time and the artifacts that are available and the worlds that they are able to enter by virtue of the access to this technology. The third case, this in the civics report, the National Academy of Education civics report, we concluded with a letter that had been published of a 6-year-old boy in the United States who wrote a letter during the Syrian war to President Obama, where he had seen this visual on television of the horrors of what happens to these children in Syria. And he writes Obama and says, "I want you to send this letter to this little boy so that he can know he can come here to the United States and live with me, and me and my sister will help him," right? The disposition that children have for moral and ethical connections. And you situate that, contrast to the fighting and all that's what's going on now. And the plague in the South Pacific, you have to be taught. Children don't come into the world with this kind of hatred. And so I had taken them to this children's museum. And the first activity was a spaceship. And they could put on little space, outfits or whatever and go in. And there's this little white boy who's maybe a year or so older than he was 4 at the time. And they just hit it off. And they start playing together. And the little white boy is helping him, get up into the spaceship. And then they go to the fire department. They become a team, fire department team working together. They don't know each other. They never saw each other for that day, but yet somehow they had developed this personal relationship. And again, I'm saying this is a disposition. Children are born with this capacity for a connection. Uh, this is my sixth. He's 7. I was 6 when we did this. His sister is a 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old they live in Virginia. They had come to visit us, and the 12-year-old hadn't come. So he's like by himself, and his cousins were there getting bored. So he finds a box in the house, and he tells his father he wants a glue gun. And then he perceives over time the evolutions of this to put together this. I don't know if it's a space, it may very well be a spaceship, because he also loves looking at videos about planets. You can ask him about anything about any planet. He's 6 years old, he will tell it all. But just the the detail and the nuance and the balance. He did this completely on his own. Nobody asked him, nobody helped him, totally, on his own. And again, this essential aspect of child development, of this creative motivation to explore, to create, to have, visions, and to take all kinds of time. The time it took him, and he went through multiple cycles, cutting out all these little pieces and getting the glue gun to go right or whatever. This this case, we had gone to another children's museum. It's actually the Children's Museum at Navy Pier. And there's a section in there where it's like an architecture kind of thing. And they have the task that the museum had designed was that you were to build a tower that was taller than whatever the model they had. When they started the game, the 12-year-old was not interested. She was sitting on the side and she's watching. This is her little brother, he's the one who built whatever you saw in the last slide. But the interesting that she decided to take up the task that was given her to build this tower, straight up. He decided to do something completely different. And I didn't get the video part of this thing because you pick it up and shake it and the parts all kind of move. And so what he had to figure out in terms of balancing the light to make it do that. But again, they're in the same family. They're deeply close. Their parents are in many ways taking on. We have raised our children in African and cultural kind of focus, and they're all into that. But they have two completely different people with two different completely ways of making decisions how to take up the importance of being in this place. Then the interesting thing for me, again, around sort of the intuitive development of conceptual understanding, in this case, it's around physics. This is my son, my oldest son, who's a civil engineer. So when he takes up a task, you see that his is not multi-dimensional, one straight up. And I don't know enough about the physics to tell about the triangular pieces, he puts in to solidify to get to be stable. His daughter, on the other hand, the 12-year-old, has a whole different set of principles about how do you get this thing to be stable going up, which is these even pieces, to be steady going up. And she, when she got her peak as high as her father's, she just said she explicitly said, I want to make one bigger than my daddy. And he then helped her out. And that's when you can see she begins to appropriate the physics, whatever that thing is he did, to stabilize it, in terms of going up. Then no, this is the final case. This is the 8-year-old who, her brother, told her he won't be my sister anymore. And she is always constructing buildings. So she can be at home. Uh, um, Nicole knows, she knows all, what time she knows it. So she'll be at home and she will get on her own some big box that has come into the house, and she gets scissors and she'll cut holes and connect pieces or whatever to make this building, if you will, that she and her brother will go in and occupy. And then when we go to the museum, this was another children's museum. I think it was the same one over Navy Pier. Every time I take her to one or the other, she's going to find the same kind of pieces and put together and build some kind of construction that she and her brother and anybody else she can get to come in. And what does this, nobody asked her to do it. Nobody encouraged her, nobody, any conversations with her about it. But how she figures out to get it to be something stable is some sort of disposition, this notion of group membership, but also individual variation, which we don't have a good handle on in terms of studying how they sort of work in tandem. Then this final case, we were at a place called Urban Air, where people bring children to have birthday parties, and they have all kinds of climbing and games and all kinds of things going on. So one of the games involves the kids go into this little section thing, and they have to put on something where they have these like big guns, it's like a laser thing, right? And go around and you can get people or whatever. And the line to get in was long. So we decided we didn't want to stand in that line that long, and we left. And this young lady in the jumpsuit with the green stripes down, who my granddaughter had never met her, never laid eyes on her before, but they had started talking while we were there. And then we left. And when the line got shorter, she went around and found us and brought us back so that we would have the opportunity to go in again. They didn't know. All of these activities that I'm sharing are ones for me that reflect some fundamental human dispositions that children are born with, that if cultivated, I think would not lead to these voracious fights that we're having right now because of the weapons. And then the second one was one of the tasks. Just see the video first. So the little one in the middle, he's the one that was up there with the karate, and he can't quite make it up. And those. Okay. So if these dispositions, being inquisitive, to explore, to be disposed toward fairness, to build strong positive attachments with others, to reason deeply, are appreciated and supported in our socializing institutions, our broader human communities, I think, would be more empathetic, more thoughtful, more disposed to seek a common good despite our differences. These socializing institutions include families, social networks, schools, and an array of community institutions. The hateful environment that we're currently experiencing in the US and around the world exists in part because our institutions, and I point in particular to public education, do not build on the strength and beauty that children bring with them. As the song from the play South Pacific says, you have to be carefully taught. And so again, here that none of these activities were directed by adults. None of them took place in schools. None of them are dependent on being middle class. And each of these activities illustrates dispositions that all children have because they are human, while at the same time illustrating individual variation. I must preface this discussion around neuroscience warrants for this by admitting that this focus on neurosciences is in no way an area of expertise for me. I have to thank my two neuroscience friends for helping me to think about these issues, and Andy Meltzoff from the University of Washington and Mary Helen Immordino Yang from the University of California at Irvine. I have offered everyday examples of children's natural dispositions to value fairness, dispositions that over time can unfortunately be turned around toward hate for the other as a definition of fairness. But reality shows us that humans are capable of both good and evil, of giving for others and for seeking to destroy others. Currently, certainly children fight one another, argue with one another as they seek to fulfill ego-focused goals. But ideally, more often than not, adult caretakers help children to weigh the consequences of their decisions on the other person and seek to offer children support for finding other ways to navigate their differences. Now, I got a pocket full of them, and I'll end up swallowing if I take them now. So thanks. At the same time, such socializing efforts by adult stakeholders is also influenced by larger macro level belief systems. During both the Holocaust of enslavement and the Holocaust of the Second World War, illustrate the pervasive influences of broader macro level belief systems on how parents and adult stakeholders socialize children, teaching them to hate. Most tragically, we are wrestling with similar conundrums today in our country. Thus, my attention and that of the National Academy's Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse report argue for the consequential role that public education can and should play in redirecting the influences that seek to teach children and young people to hate. We know from basic physiology that there is in the brain the most basic brain stem associated with what is called the fight or flight automatic response to perceptions of threat. This response, triggered by the brain's perception of threat, is rooted in our evolution as a species. The response is rooted in the ways that the brain inputs from physical experiences and the perceptions of experience of emotional responses. Because this need from an evolutionary perspective is and has been essential to survival, and because the stimulus is emotional salience that we attribute to experience, we ignore the function of emotional salience that we attribute to our experience at peril. But the story is complex. In addition to regions of the brain that process emotions, there are also regions that coordinate with the primitive brain stem to process cognition. For example, there are many professions in which training focuses on people learning to overcome, to override perceptions of threat, and to modulate our responses to for what for most people would be perceived as threatening, to regulate behaviors to invoke cognitive processes learned to wrestle with what would normally be threatening. This is the case for firefighters, policemen and women, the military, and even physically combative sports such as boxing, wrestling, football, and karate. But we also have evidence that perceptions of meaningful social attachments can also trigger a redirection of flight in the face of danger. You think of parents protecting their children as one example. What we now understand is that complex networks within the brain interact with one another in dialogic processes in which emotions, cognition, and perceptions interact to fuel our actions. And what is particularly interesting is that the same networks that monitor our physiological processes around things like hunger and bodily stress, fever and pain, are also taken up in processing our cognition. And in many ways, it is the emotional salience that we attribute to that which we experience through our bodies, what we see, touch, hear, that triggers and recruits from across brain networks how we respond. We develop schemas for phenomena, conceptions of value relationships, conceptions of artifacts, conceptions of values, schemas that are captured in neural networks that we recruit, most often automatically depending on how deeply entrenched or connected are the relevant schemas that inform emotional salience that we attribute to experience. And this is just a screenshot. Mary Immordino Yang has done some interesting work that they do at the law school, but you can get the whole thing on YouTube. But just the connection to examples include how by evolution we are disposed to attend to facial features. We know that infants pay more attention to human faces than objects. They're not taught, they come that way, right? The abilities that we have developed over cultural historical time with the invention of print involved recruiting our primordial attention to facial features toward new goals of physical perception. We can also think about how we have developed schemas to attribute three-dimensional attributes to two-dimensional artifacts like paintings and photographs. You know, you look at a photograph, and we've developed a schema to interpret indicators that our brain perceives as three-dimensional when it's really a two-dimensional surface. We have learned from the Human Genome Project that humans have fewer genes than what we have presumed to be in simpler plants and animals. Thus, our genes are programmed to learn from experience, enabling us to evolve. One might think about our abilities to adapt as akin to capacities of the viral world to mutate and adapt from experience. So, what are the takeaways here? One, that thinking and emotions are deeply intertwined and interdependent, that perceptions of the self, of others, tasks, and settings matter, that humans are adaptive and involved in multiple pathways of development, that this is both normative and essential. So why does all this matter? So I want to take up three implications for these ideas, although there are certainly additional implications. First, we do not pay sufficient attention to the role that emotions play in understanding and helping to shape human learning and development. While we have important emerging attention to what is being called social emotional learning or SEL, that work tends to be isolated and segmented. This, I think, is partially informed by prior focus on regions of the brain rather than interconnected networks. Underlying such current efforts is also attention to how teaching SEL can help students develop executive control, with the assumption that executive control is a stable capacity, not influenced by settings and perceptions in the moment. It is rare that attention to supports for SEL is explicitly attended to in regular classroom instruction, a climate and culture at both the classroom and the school level. It's even more rare to see any consideration to how emotions are influenced and can be differentiated across cultural communities. Second, perceptions are an essential component of the developmental system. While there is an important history of attention to phenomenology in human development, the complexities of self-perceptions remain very restrictive in other fields. Perceptions of the self are complex and multidimensional. We perceive of ourselves as individuals, as members of an array of social networks, family, friends, an array of communities of practice. These communities of practice are often intergenerational and are often taken up across spaces such as national borders. These communities of practice are both homogeneous and heterogeneous. They are stable and changing. This concept is particularly challenging to understand, but again, obvious in everyday experience that we have in the world. For a variety of reasons, in many cases political around wielding power and determining who is in and who is out, we construct social categories that are intended to represent cultural communities. Among the most pervasive of these social categories is that of race. Certainly in the US, race dominates our politics, dominates our research efforts in many ways. Race is a recent construct in human history. Beginning in the 17th century, philosophers and biologists began to argue that human communities could be differentiated and exist in intellectual and moral hierarchies. From pseudoscientific studies of craniology to systemic eugenics, race has been viewed through the lens of skin color or the amount of melanin we have. We have clear evidence that the genetic differences within presumed racial groups is greater than the genetic differences of presumed different racial groups. Within the US, who gets to be quote unquote white has shifted across time, responding to different political interests. We use the term people of color, which presumes there are some people with color and others without. The reality is that all humans have colors. No humans are white or black. All humans simply have different gradations of brown from what we might think of as ivory to deep chocolate brown. So these racial categories that we exist are totally arbitrary. Some of you probably look at Finding Your Roots, and Henry Louis Gates was interviewing this actor, I forget his name, but he went back in his census record, and whether his great-great-great-grandfather, whatever it was, in 1 year, he was black. And then the next census, the same man was mulatto. And then the next census, he was white. Right? Um, so all of these categories, we really begin to examine them, are totally artificial and trying to interrogate, like, why do we have them? What do distinctions make? And I always argue again that there are more people of African descent relative to the question of melanin in Brazil than in the United States. And quite interestingly, this was an interesting image that had been put out some years ago. Again, we know from genetics that uh, all human beings evolved from Africa, so really we're all African. Okay. And again, with indigenous people, the way in which race has instructed all of these policies and practices historically that we have has adapted. And again, all attached to the history. So this again is the part of the conundrum I'm probably getting at is that what I'm inferring from what I see as this evolving science of human learning, that you have to take biology into account. You have to take into account human physiological processes that evolve as a species. The problem as we take it up now is that we all have this memory of eugenics and the like, and way in which biology was used in a pseudoscientific way to make deficits for others. So it's a hard sell at some point to make. But my argument ultimately is that because these dispositions evolved from our evolution as a species, we ignore them at our own peril. I always say that Mama Nature says, I'm in full control. I have created this complex universe. You'll never fully understand it. And if you want to ignore it or go your way, you can. But at the end of the day, like with the little viruses that are smarter, COVID virus is smarter than we are because it understands that adaptation is necessary, you know what I mean, for survival. And so I'm just saying we had this interesting moment in time where this has become very difficult for us to wrestle with. I'm out of time, so I'm going to try to move real quickly through these slides. So I'm arguing that instead of race, ethnicity is a stronger construct to look at in terms of human communities. So that in our efforts to understand human functioning, how humans learn to navigate the world, how they learn to be resilient in face of systemic and persistent challenges, attention to ethnicity offers useful resources for understanding how participation in cultural practices, particularly those that are sustained across time, provide more robust insights than a sole attention to politically inspired social constructions such as race. So for those who identify by the society as Black, attention to African as a pan-ethnicity, belief systems, practices, and value social networks are more powerful in terms of explanatory power. Uh, so then I want to close out with an example, because one of the other arguments that I'm making is that, yeah, human nature is complex, all the dielectric interdependence, you know what I mean? That's what it is. I'm trying to see it in my grandkid in a way of helping me to understand it. But then there's the questions of what does this mean about research design? So my hope then has been to illustrate with some exemplars from everyday practices that the complex system of human learning and development, while complex, is evident before us in real life every day. And that as researchers who seek to understand such complexity in order to inform efforts to build robust learning and development should not be overwhelmed and develop the humility to learn how people live. So I'm going to try to get through this real quick. One example I've argued is the work of Jeff Sachs' work in Papua New Guinea, that looking at how to capture the significance of development over cultural historical time. So he spent like 20 years of studying this construct of full representation of a arithmetic system among the food. And at the same time, to understand how there were shifts in cultural historical time over institutions that evolved, how exchange took place, the influence of the Australian economy, going to stores to buy things with exchange. And so he attempted to capture, and I love these sort of representations you have, this issue of how do I capture the influences of cultural historical time over social practices? And equally, how do I understand ontogenetic time? That is, where you were at the point of these cultural historical shifts, and how does that influence what your perceptions of this construct of food are? Right away. Some work that I had done also tried to take into account all of these, if you think about it, sort of psychosocial factors beyond cognition in and itself as influences on people's learning and development. So we've done some work and had measures of epistemology, positive coping, racial identity, beliefs about malleability, and how these were connected to outcomes of interest. So I'm going to just close with two interesting conundrum points of taking up that I think are interesting implications of this work. One is insufficient attention to hybridity. So this is here is an image of the blind singer, God help me, I'm so Stevie Wonder, right? Wherever it is that he's playing, and then this country western guy who's like, performing with him. The issue of how to, as I use this as an example, closing out, both of you heard me last year, did this as well, of what it means to understand in these times of these big contests and fights that we are having, how it is that there are communities, and I'm going to use African American community as an example. And this is just Marian Anderson singing in 1939 at the Lincoln Monument. Quite the irony of the complexities of Lincoln. She's living in the midst of Jim Crow, right? Told by the Daughters of the American Revolution that she couldn't sing in the whatever the congressional place was that they had, and how what that the importance of being able to understand what it is that she brought, what resources does she have available to be able to stand up in the midst of living in that, the depth of Jim Crow, the direct attacks on her, and still be able to sing about America. Yes, fast. Gotta go.
Nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her Capitol debut at the Great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables. Here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
Is Eleanor Roosevelt. And so I'm arguing in closing for real that there is much in opportunity from emerging big ideas of the science of human learning and development to say what do we need as constructs and fundamental assumptions to understand her willingness to live in the midst of Jim Crow, be told she couldn't sing by the Daughters of American Revolution, and then, you know, do this performance. This closing is something I just captured, and this is another little piece that we do with my grandkids. Despite all this negative fighting and craziness that's going on in the country right now, that if you look at media, advertisement on television, you see diversity all over the place, which means that the feminist people understand that the people with all this nuttiness they're talking about are not the majority. They're not the audience, and again, this thing part of the whole. And I'm going to apologize. I'm going to just let this play just a few seconds long. It's put out by some Christian group and talk about Jesus at the end. I'm not advocating anything about Jesus, but the representation of this, what does it mean, going back to my grandkids, of really what it means to sort of take up the powerful possibilities that children are born with, to love, to be empathetic, to connect with others.
If I could see the world through the eyes of a child, what a wonderful world this would be. There'd be no trouble and no
Apologize for having gone so long in terms of conversation, but I hope it will spark some new kinds of conversations about the opportunities of being able to root our attention to issues around social justice and equity in the world, to be informed by what this evolving science of human learning and development makes possible for us to think about. So thank you.